Okay, experiment time. What can we learn about aggregate supply and aggregate demand without actually having to come to class? Our goal here would be to listen to me for a while, watch this, read the book, and then there'll be a little handout for you to play with on web campus. Okay, so here we go. Here we go. Aggregate demand. Aggregate means total in this context. It means total. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply is an attempt to create supply and demand in total for the whole economy. It's not the same exactly as regular supply and demand. It's gonna be different. So aggregate demand is total planned expenditure, not necessarily actual expenditure. At equilibrium, it'll be actual expenditure. But by definition, it's total planned expenditure at all the possible different prices that can happen in the economy. Okay? Aggregate demand is made up of consumption, investment, government spending, exports, imports, taxes, and the money supply. If you remember life, you know that basically that's the circular flow plus the money supply. Those things that are in that circular flow as we go round and around and around the flow, those things are aggregate demand. So here's again our picture of the flow with the lions and the cantaloupes and the grass. And you see consumption, savings, taxes, imports, exports, government spending, investment, and consumption. The flow as it goes around from households to businesses, back to the resource owners, back to the households to the businesses, and around. Everything that happens in this flow is tied to aggregate demand. So when the government spends more, that's going to increase aggregate demand. When taxes go up, that's going to decrease aggregate demand. When exports go up, that's going to increase aggregate demand. If imports go up, that's going to decrease aggregate demand. Everything that's in this circular flow is going to increase or decrease aggregate demand. Okay, so that curve looks like this. So instead of putting one price, the price of, lemons on the y-axis, we have prices, which is a kind of a combination price of everything. You can actually, I sometimes think of it, in fact, as the inflation rate more than prices, but prices are good. Think of it as being, here's where prices are. On the x-axis, we don't have the quantity of one thing, we have the quantities of everything. And as you already should know, we call that, the measure of output in the economy, real GDP. So real GDP is on the x-axis. That's telling us the total amount we produce. It's also therefore telling us how much employment is, how many people have jobs, and with that, it's also going to tell us how much unemployment there is. To produce more, we need more employees. To produce less, we need fewer employees. So we'll make sense of this. The aggregate demand curve does not slope downward because we buy more when prices go down. And the reason for that is that you and I are on that aggregate demand curve. What I mean by that is that aggregate demand includes wages. So the prices on that left-hand side include the price of people. I know that seems odd, but just live with it. It includes the prices of people. So what we get on that aggregate demand curve, when the prices go down, that means not only are the prices we pay going down, but what businesses are paying us is going down. Wages and prices are both going down. So if we cut every price in half, but we cut our pay in half, we're not actually going to end up buying more because we don't have any more purchasing power. Okay? So this curve does not slope down because we're going to buy more when prices go down. Why does it slope down? It slopes down for 3 reasons. Reason number 1 is something that we call the real balance effect. And this is simple. Your pay goes down, but what you have in your savings doesn't. Think about this. You have $1,000 in savings. If prices fall in half, your $1,000 in your savings account is now worth twice as much. If, on the other hand, you have $500,000 in your retirement fund and prices go up, now the value of your retirement fund just went down and you're liable to spend less, save more. So what happens is when prices go down, your savings are worth more. You're going to spend maybe part of your savings, or spend if you're saving up for something. Now you can afford it. Affects your savings. Okay? That's called the real balance effect. What happens to people's savings when prices go up or down? Number 2, interest rates. Interest rate is the price of money. So interest rates are in there too. When prices go down, interest rates are going down. When interest rates are going down, we borrow more, both consumers and businesses, and we spend more. And so the curve is going to slope downward because as interest rates fall, we borrow money, we spend money, and businesses borrow more money and spend money. And then finally, there's an import and export effect. When prices in the U.S. go down, we buy more U.S. stuff, we buy more domestic goods, we buy fewer imports. When prices in the U.S. go down, people in other countries see our stuff being cheap, and they come in and buy it. So exports and imports are going to make this curve go down too. Okay? All right. Aggregate supply is very much like the actual individual market supply curve. So aggregate supply you can think of pretty much as the supply curve you're used to, with one exception, and we'll talk about that in a second. Aggregate supply is the representative of total production at different prices. So where an individual supply curve is the production of lemons at different prices, aggregate supply represents the production of everything at different prices. So just like regular supply, it's going to be affected by the cost of inputs, land, labor, capital, taxes on businesses, that kind of thing. And it's going to be affected by how productive they are, which means things like technology are going to have an effect on this aggregate supply curve. So the price of oil is going to be in the aggregate supply curve. If consumers are buying gasoline, then maybe that's in the aggregate demand curve. But businesses buy and rely on oil. Okay? Consumers don't buy oil. Consumers don't buy factory machines. Businesses buy factory machines. Okay. So, the most interesting thing about aggregate supply in this world now is that there's actually 2 of them. And this will make a lot more sense to you as we get into chapter 9 and 10 and 11. But there's 2 of them. There's a short-run aggregate supply and there's a long-run aggregate supply. And this goes back to some fights, as we'll see, some fights between economists in the Great Depression and the 20 or 30 years after, and the economists who came before the Great Depression. But think of it this way. Imagine that you're a worker and prices are going up. You're liable to go to your boss and ask for a raise. Your boss is going to be slower to raise your wages than they are to raise prices. When things happen, Starbucks is quicker to raise the price of the beverage than they are to give all their workers a raise. For a while, they make a lot of profit. When the price of coffee goes up and Starbucks really raises their prices, wages don't go up as fast as prices for a short time. That's why it's called short run. For a short time, the company is actually taking advantage of their workers, and they're going to produce more because they can earn a profit from the difference between how much they raised prices and how much they raise wages. Eventually, they're going to have to raise wages because prices have gone up and their workers are in need of a raise and might not work if they didn't have a raise, or they might go somewhere else if they don't get a raise. So in the long run, wages and prices both go up, and businesses don't have any reason to produce more or less than they were producing before. So when prices go up, there's a short-run burst in production. That's because businesses are taking advantage of the fact they got to raise prices but didn't have to raise wages. As they raise wages, then they go back to where they were before, just with higher wages and prices. So there's a short run aggregate supply curve, which is caused by something we call money illusion, that the workers are getting the wrong mix of wages and against their prices. And then in the long run, that doesn't have an effect. And the only thing that matters in the long run is how many workers we have, how productive they are, what capital do we have, our resources, and how we use our resources. So we get two different curves, and they look like this. So the short-run aggregate supply curve, SRAS, looks like the regular old supply curve. And again, that's only going to happen when businesses can raise their prices faster than they raise their wages. Eventually, wages catch up. And when wages catch up, we're at the LRAS. LRAS is the maximum output we can sustain over time. LRAS is full employment. LRAS means everybody who wants a job has a job. There's no unemployment. There's no economic problems. Everything is beautiful when we're on the LRAS. And a few other things that we'll talk about here in a minute. Okay? So if we put the AD and the SRAS together on a graph, it looks just like regular old supply and demand, and we have an equilibrium price, which isn't the price of one thing, it's the equilibrium price level, the equilibrium price for everything. Or again, sometimes you can think of it as being kind of an equilibrium inflation rate instead of the equilibrium prices. You get yelled at if you say that to some people, but it makes a lot more sense in the way the world works. And then we have a real GDP, which is equilibrium real GDP, which tells us how much we're producing, how many people have jobs, blah, 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 blah. And we have a beautiful little equilibrium position. If we add the LRAS, we're going to get something different. So remember that the LRAS means everybody has a job. It's full employment. It's everybody has a job. If we're to the left of that, we're to the left of LRAS. If we're over here, we have what we call a recessionary gap. Might not be a recession. Probably isn't a recession, because how often do everybody have a job? Recessionary gap just means we have unemployment. So there's something like a recession, which recessionary means people don't have jobs. So even right now, as I say this, and the unemployment rate's really good, it's around 4%, we still have unemployment. So we still have a slight recessionary gap. We don't have a recession, we have a recessionary gap. If, on the other hand, we're to the right, and you're saying, if we try to produce more than we can sustain, we work people extra hours, we bring on temps, whatever, we do something to produce in a way that's not sustainable, that we can't do forever. When we move over there, if we try to produce more, what's going to happen is we're going to steal workers from other companies, and every company is going to start stealing workers from every other company. How do you steal workers from another company? You pay them more. When you start paying your workers more, you have to raise your prices. So if we're to the right, if the economy is to the right of LRAS, what's going to happen is that wages and prices are going to go up. We're going to have inflation, and that inflation is eventually going to make it unprofitable to be to the right of LRAS. But we're going to have this inflationary gap where the economy is producing so much that prices are going up because it's unsustainable, because they're having to hire workers away from other people. And so we end up to the right. Okay? So let's do one last thing. LRAS actually has three names. Some people call it the long-run aggregate supply curve. Some people refer to it as full employment real GDP. In other words, it's the level of real GDP that gives us full employment, so they call it full employment real GDP. And some people call it natural real GDP. And why they do that will make, again, a lot more sense to you as we get into the next few chapters. It's natural. Okay? It means also that those people believe that there's a natural level of unemployment called a natural rate of unemployment that's tied to the natural real GDP. And it's kind of cute little language, and it'll make more sense to you later, but we need to make sure that we understand the terminology. There's 3 names for long-run aggregate supply. Okay, so we draw a graph. Now you're saying what? I'm saying what? When we are somewhere where always, the economy is always, you see where my little arrow is there, the economy is always where the SRAS crosses the AD. So the economy is at that point where the blue and purple lines meet, which is to the left of LRAS, which means we have a recessionary gap. So our economy right now looks something like this picture up here, where equilibrium is here, which is to the left of the LRAS. Okay? An inflationary gap looks like this. Equilibrium would be over here. AD and SRAS meet over here. We're to the right of LRAS. That's an unsustainable employment position, which is going to cause inflation. So we get an inflationary gap. Okay? All right. Now, what happens as the economy changes? Well, here we have a picture of AD increasing. Aggregate demand moving from 1 to 2. This could happen, for example, government spends more money, exports go up, businesses invest more, we have a tax cut on people. Okay? What's supposed to happen, AD should go to the right. We get more real GDP. We move from here to here. Real GDP has gone up, which means more people have jobs. We're employing more people. But at the same time, we're going to get inflation out of that. We're going to get prices going up. So we just did a big tax cut. What happened? Well, some people got jobs because of that tax cut. Real GDP moved out. But we're also seeing higher rates of inflation than we've seen in a long time. That's consistent, totally consistent with an increase in aggregate demand happening because of the tax cut. If aggregate demand falls, the opposite happens. Real GDP goes down. That means we're producing less. That means people are going to lose their jobs. We're going to get unemployment. And also, we'll see, generally speaking, either prices going down or inflation getting less severe. Okay? Aggregate supply. Here's an aggregate supply increase. Aggregate supply moves to the right. It increases. That means we're able to produce more. With the same number of workers, the same everything, we're able to produce more. We move out in real GDP, we're producing more. That means we have more jobs, more employment, everything's good, and because it's an increase in supply, to sell that extra supply, businesses are going to have to lower their prices, so we get more jobs and lower prices. If you could do anything in a perfect world, you would want aggregate supply to always keep increasing, because that creates jobs and lowers prices. What could be better than that? More money, lower prices. Okay? And then finally, what happens if aggregate supply goes down? It moves to the left. Now, because we're producing less, people are going to lose their jobs. We're going to have less real GDP. And at the same time, prices are going to go up. Now, a good example of that would be the 70s. We had these huge increases in oil prices. Businesses are having to pay more for everything they do because basic raw material, oil is more expensive. Aggregate supply moves to the left because there's less profit for them to make. They're going to lay off workers. We're going to lose real GDP. But because the price of making whatever product they're making has gone up, they are going to have to raise their prices. Okay, so we're done. Now go do your other stuff on Web Campus.